Good timing.
I know. Just in time.
Welcome, good evening. This is a special meeting of the Kent School District Board, which is held in public to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act. The purpose of this meeting is a work session to review and discuss board policies. President Hamada will be absent from this meeting this evening, and Chief Accountability Officer Dr. Jewel Harmon will be attending via Zoom. And I'm now going to call upon Interim Superintendent Vela to introduce Chief Accountability Officer Dr. Jewel Harmon to begin the protocol and policy discussion.
Thank you, Vice President Benno. I appreciate the time today and the time the board is putting into another important evening on policy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Accountability Officer Dr. Jewel Harmon.
Good evening, Vice President Benno, members of the board, Interim Superintendent Vela, and Ms. Vantello. We are here this evening, as Vice President Benno stated, to do an April policy work session. I will apologize, I probably sound worse than it really is. There may be some coughing, and it's a good thing I'm not sitting with you. I think it's just allergies and pollen in the spring. But we're gonna press forward. So I'll start with the reminder about our WASDA policy classifications. Essential means that there's some state or federal ordinance that requires that a policy be in effect. Encouraged means that there's not a state or federal law or requirement that there's policy, but it's in the district's best interest from a legal standpoint to have a policy around the topic. And then discretionary, there is no legal requirement or intention around having a policy, but they're best suited to clarify for the community and for staff the board's intentions and expectations for operation. And so with that, we're going to jump right in and move right to policy 3520. I'm intentionally not working in the PowerPoint show, just because I think it'll be a little bit easier to toggle and share screen as we discuss what's happening. 3520 deals with student fines and fees. These next three policies deal with something that I wrote the board about in the board update, and that is very timely in terms of addressing for our students in graduation. But it also fits in line with the board's intentions of updating policies, especially those that are significantly outdated. And so this was last revised by WASDA in 2021, but in KSD in 2002. There was some legal language that doesn't demand that there is a policy in the district for addressing student fines and fees necessarily. But the language does talk about what is required in terms of repayment and what, I guess, consequences, outcomes are possible and allowed if payment does not happen. And so with that, I am going to show you the student fines and fees or charges policy. This document that you're seeing now reflects the WASDA model policy. For a second there, it didn't show up. WASDA model policy with track changes, all the markup. So with all the markup present. So this reflects the language that has been added and changed. As I wrote about in the board update, it's a little bit of a nuanced shift because there are RCWs that impact this that compete a little bit. So for example, the debt that students have can be addressed by providing some community service. That is if they have, for example, lost a book, had some destruction of property, even unintentional, or any of those kinds of things. But if the debt is due to meals, they are not allowed to do any type of community service or working off that debt according to the law, unless all students are also doing that exact same work, which would be unlikely because in this instance, the students are doing the community service to address a specific debt need. So that's where it gets a little bit complicated, and that's where the language has been updated to reflect those two pieces. One, the fact that community service is a viable option. Our previous version of this policy in Kent School District reflected the law and the allowables at the time, which was that students could work off the debt, meaning odd jobs and other things, but that is no longer the case. It can only be done with community service. And then it also did not address the change to the no shaming meals bill, which prevents it, again, if it's lunch debt and students working it off, even if it's community service. So I'll open it up to the board for thoughts or comments.
I have a question for Superintendent Bella. This is old policy, and so I don't know if it's still in effect, but the old policies were actually restricted by state law that said you can withhold a transcript up until the start of the new fiscal year, but that's pretty much it, in which case you have to write off the debt. Is that accurate?
I do recall that in the past where we had done that.
Right.
And I know over time, Dr. Harmon, you'll have to help me with this, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've backed off of that kind of restriction, if you will, for obvious reasons, equity and a number of other things. And so that's what I do recall. As far as if it's something we still have in play, Dr. Harmon?
Director Clark and Interim Superintendent Bella, you are correct. That was the statute of the law at the time. That is also one of the legal changes that has happened. Okay. School districts are no longer allowed to hold a transcript or grades for debts owed for any reason. They can withhold diplomas, and they can prevent other participation in other activities, but they cannot withhold a transcript and they cannot withhold grades.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions?
I don't have a question, but I just noticed a typo. So in the third paragraph and the second to last sentence, the word annually appears twice. So procedure for annually notifying annually parents of the availability. So just, yeah.
Thank you. Any other feedback? I mean, I guess I have a comment. I struggle with the fact that we have option for community service in here when, as a district, we're trying to employ restorative practices, and I don't know if that's equal. So, like, I know this is an update from Wasa, but I don't love the language of making students do community service or whatever to work off debt. Like, it just feels, I don't know, I don't like how it feels. I'm not a fan, so I don't know if that means we need to change anything, but I just don't necessarily love that, especially if we're looking at a restorative model in our district.
So I would like if the board would allow for us to spend a little bit of time discussing that and the intentions, because essentially what will happen with the next two policies is whatever language or intention the board decides will then show itself again in the subsequent two policies, because it's kind of referring back to the same thing. Because they're all dealing with how students receive grades or either what's the consequence regarding a debt.
Okay.
And if you recall, in the update, I think I might have even titled it something about when core values collide. Yes. In terms of what happens for us as a district. Because in all honesty, the debt is real, and the option by law is that they can have community service. We are required under the law to offer it for students who are unable to pay. But it doesn't say that that can't be our offering for all students. So all students can have that opportunity to provide community service. So it's not a designation of a student being necessarily low income or having less financial ability. I will say this. It does not, and this is where the extension of this conflicts even more. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if the student uses community service to satisfy the debt to the district, which is great for their professional growth and they're moving into adulthood of how to serve their community and become contributing members of society, it does not provide the financial resources back to the district that they would have to pay. So at some point, the district would still be having a conversation about writing off some debt, which Director Clark alluded to in the prior law. The current law don't make any mention of that reality for students. And prior board members, I think if President Hamada were here, Director Bettinger, you may remember there was quite a robust discussion in Kent about student lunch debt when the No Shame bill came out, and how the bill language actually increases student lunch debt for districts, and they are pressed with a conundrum of how to satisfy that debt.
So my question is it looks like what has happened is that this policy, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this policy now is talking, it's removed the school lunch debt piece of it, but it's mostly about replacing things that are lost or damaged due to negligence. But then the next paragraph is about, it's about, damage, violation and damage or something. So the word violation, I don't know what that refers to. Violation of what? And then again, it's like lost or at first it's like materials lost or damaged due to negligence, and we all know kids lose things, right? But then somehow it weirdly goes into this, like a willful ruining of something that they have to pay for, and there's no logical jump between that.
If I can, I'm laughing, being from a previous generation where you inherited used textbooks from somebody else.
Yeah.
But in the digital age, where they're literally going out the door with equipment, sometimes on short-term use, could be cameras, could be a variety of things, but suddenly that becomes a real financial stress. One kid by themselves is minimal, but the problem with it is when you put a laptop in every single kid's hand in their senior year, and then they're upset because they didn't pass math, bad things can happen. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem because it turns into real money.
And that's what I was kind of alluding to with restorative practices, like the restorative practice might be paying for it. Like if they break the sink off the wall in the bathroom, the restorative practice might be they help with the process of fixing it or pay to get repaired or whatnot.
Right.
Like that's where the restorative practice is in that, or they may, do this community service or whatnot. But I think that needs to be kind of clarified as we look at that, what that looks like.
And we have insurance, like if someone, you could technically consider it negligence if someone like leaves their laptop in the car and they have to run into the daycare to pick up a sibling or something and someone steals the laptop, right? So we do have insurance for something like that, right?
So there are coverages. We also, again, only because of the time and duration on service over the past year, Director Benno, Director Bettinger, Vice President Benno, Director Bettinger may remember the increase in the laptop service budget. Remember, we brought to the board probably maybe about 7 or 8 months ago, we had to increase the repair bills because of that. Because students were using their laptops way more heavily because of COVID and the closure. And for the first time ever, we've given our K3, our primary students, access to a device full time. And so with that came a little bit of learning curve and some damage, not necessarily intentionally, but just wear and tear.
Yep.
Also, it is rare, but we do have some intentional damage done. I would allude a little bit to what Director Clark mentioned, sometimes out of emotion. A student may react and whatever's closest takes the brunt of that. I will say too, one other thing to remember is that a lot of this debt that happens for students doesn't happen in their senior year. It's the culmination of 13 years with Kent School District. So I'll use my son as an example of this. He's 5 and in kindergarten. And 13 years from now, when it's time for him to graduate, if I did not add enough money to his lunch account, if he lost a library book, and they were not addressed, ultimately, it becomes the high schools, it lands at the high school's lap, essentially, or feet, to address that and recoup the dollars on behalf of the district. And this came up this year because it was the first time in 2 years that our students are going back to ShoWare for live graduations in person with their family, with their friends. And it came up of, what do we do about debt with our students? Do we prevent them from walking? Do we, do we withhold the diploma? Do we allow them to walk but withhold tickets? Our principals definitely rose to the occasion of equity as a core value and decided that they weren't going to limit any of those things, but thought it was best that we bring this to the board to codify that policy because it wasn't necessarily listed in the policy that way. So from a staff perspective, the intention is not to prevent access for students, but we do need to have a way to address kind of what to do about, like, what is the official action that should happen here?
So again, it's like, because this looks like it used to cover school lunches and things like that, is this we have to kind of, I think, a deeper discussion is this to address if someone willfully breaks, steals, ruins something, or is this also, because again, I mean, a library book that I had checked out when I was 12, hopefully, I always thought my experience with my kids in this district is they let you know before the end of the year that a book is due and things like that. So I'm a little confused by that, but we want kids to be responsible citizens and things like that and treat everything properly, but there's two different situations there, right? It's like a kid with ADHD who just loses things, or a kid that willfully ruins something. And yes, there's a cost to the district, but I guess this policy is just, now that it's been updated, it's just sort of schizophrenic a little bit to me.
Would it be more helpful to the board, what we could do? So first, whenever we go through this process, we present to you the pure version of WASDA's update, meaning WASDA's language. What we could do is have a second reading and discussion, so not necessarily bring it to the board for an action in April, but present a second version that kind of cleanly addresses the different pieces. So pull out a section for kind of willful negligence or destruction of property, and then a section for kind of unintentional damages or fines and fees. I think the challenge with that, I'll make an attempt, but the challenge with that is, how do you determine what is willful and intentional unless it is absolutely egregious?
Right.
And then the other is, I have to say that as a parent of a 5-year-old who lost a library book this year, and I'm very embarrassed about that, and then we tore up the house finding it, it's not really, I mean, it's as much the child's fault, but I took some responsibility for that as a parent, of like, okay, I know my child. Why wasn't it in the book bag? We read it the other night. Where could it be? Right. So how we go about that. But I think an initial solution may be trying to divide that out so at least it's clear. So a staff member or a family member can go to this section if it's this, and this section if it's just, no, it's lost, it's unintentional. Possibly even pulling out the piece around, meal debt. As so it's very clear what the pieces of this are and what the next step should be.
Right. And I mean, in that, you bring up something too that is, we haven't even talked about, is just, there are situations where things might get damaged, lost, stolen through no fault of the child's own, but just based on their living situation, right? You might have a sibling who grabs your library book and decides to take it with them on their trip because they need a book to read, and then leave it in San Diego. I don't know. And other worse things, right? And so, this one's hard.
Yeah. I just have two things that I just wanted to ask clarification on. How do we determine the $100 limit? And the other one I wanted to know is, let's say a scenario is a student has a fee, and then, like we said, the high school inherits the fees, and it's the last few days of the school. How do we determine short-term suspension?
So, what is a suspendable activity is, I'm sorry, and I apologize for not being prepared for this question, is outside of the realm of my area of expertise. What I know is that our principals and our schools do not seek to suspend first, but that is the language under the law. Under the law says that a suspension is possible or can happen. That's not necessarily saying that's our intention to happen. That's from the law. But our principals don't seek to suspend first.
Yeah, I'd like to add, no, I appreciate the conversation and the questions. One of the things that, having been a principal, they or their staff are the ones that are assessing each situation that has come up on the dais today. And Director Bettinger, you're right, there's a wide array of situations I know that I've heard of over the years. And so, to Director Farah's point, there is a lot of things that happen that aren't the same across the board. So to assess things, I think of the word inconsistency that could occur in equity in some of the things that could happen. So I agree with Vice President Bento's earlier comment about, are we truly looking at restorative practices?
Right.
Even if we have a practice that may be inconsistent. So there's lots of variables here, is I guess, bottom line.
Yeah.
So I think
Right.
what I was going to finish with is that the thing that I know our principals do is they do take those things into consideration. Home life, they take into consideration if that student may or may not be homeless. They might be in transition in another home. Now, those are the things that I know I've heard over the years come up. And so, I just wanted the board to know that our team does do that. So as we look at these, that we look at each one, and I like what Dr. Harmon is talking about, let's kind of break these up so that we can be pretty clear about what is negligence and what are some things that could be under that. What might be willful destruction of property, because we do have situations like that. We might have things on camera where we see it, those kinds of things. So we're on the right track, if you will.
Right, but the thing I wanted to also couple with that is we leave it to the principal, and history says that's not. Some of these principals are not looking at students of color, students who are not students of color the same way. So punishment can be. So if we leave it to the principal to decide, my concern is that more suspension or what have you will fall onto kids who are BIPOC.
Yeah, we want to make sure the systems, we want to make sure, like, for example, if there's a policy that we're trying to follow to the letter, right? Because ideally we do that. But if it's a policy that principals are using discretion on to, to address situations, and to Director Farah's point, that's, unless it's kind of laid out more clear that principals have discretion, but we have to make sure we watch bias, right?
Yep.
Because and I understand. So I'm a stickler for policies, but I'll be the first to say that if a policy is hurting a kid, then we need to address that. So and sometimes I understand that probably principals do ignore a policy because it's helping a kid based on their situation, but then that's where you run into the danger of bias. Yeah, and so it's like keeping obviously to Dr. Harmon's point too, we want good citizens, and we want to make sure that they're learning to be respectful and responsible to the extent they can. So this one's really actually tricky.
It is, I agree. And part of also hearing like the idea of, it really bothers me to hear that the word student lunch debt actually exists. And I know that I've advocated that we should just feed all students. And I know budgetary, that's not always possible, but we need to look for any grants or whatever that will let us feed students and not have debt for students just to eat. And that's ridiculous in itself, but that's a whole other discussion. So my bad, Dr. Harmon.
So, shameless plug, at the April board meeting, there will be a presentation from Nutrition Services about the expansion of CEP and some other things addressing kind of meal service going forward. So just know that that's coming.
Good.
I'm sure Teresa will cringe when she hears me say it to the world to expect that. She knows she's prepared, but now she will definitely be watching. So that will be talked about.
Right.
Possibly a solution here, and I will say that our principals are absolutely on the same page that you all are on. Their intention is not to suspend. When they talked about this, they're not out of line with where you all are going. And what they agreed is that if the board were interested in a policy that focused on restorative practices, more on community service, that they would like to get together and develop a kind of continuum of possibilities for community service to address some of the things that you all have talked about, as well as the price point. So when we talk about this, for example, what could community service look like for a student? Is it attending a board meeting? Is it possibly, but is it 3 board meetings? If your amount, if you damaged a laptop that's worth about $575, but if you have if you have a library book that's worth $15, then is it the same? What is that piece? So they are willing to spend some time around what that looks like so that there's consistent opportunities and expectations across our buildings.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because again, we want to make sure there's discretion, but not bias. And that's hard.
Yeah.
And then what that also gives is the principal and the family an opportunity to consider what their options are, because they may need an option that's not transportation heavy, or they may need an option, you know what I mean? All of those kinds of things. So we will work on that piece as well, and I'll make a formal note just so it's here. And I also made the note to make an attempt to kind of pull those pieces out and separate the discussion of the 3 kind of topic areas, so it's a little easier to understand and follow.
Great.
Also sounds like some good financial literacy to teach students as well.
Yeah, well,
Sorry.
yeah.
Any other discussion on this? I think we're ready to move on, Dr. Harmon.
Okay. So our next policy, and these should move fairly quickly because they are kind of going along the same line. So this one is student records, and it is specifically been narrowed down to the withholding of transcripts and diplomas when or it's being withheld for fines or fees. And so I will. I apologize, it is not in the form where you can see everything, like for all the markup to show, it might be a little bit confusing. This is another where we have not updated this in a little while. Again, 2021 for Wasa, 2007 for Kent School District. And this one was updated in 2001 to specifically address the law. So Senate Bill 1176 specifically speaks to not being allowed to withhold transcripts and grades due to fines and student debt. And so then the language of the policy then kind of codifies those pieces, the responsibility of keeping the data, responsibility of who else. And so it's a little bit larger than just that. So there are pieces of this that address just student records, period, who has access. So parents, how student records are protected. But another piece of this speaks to what cannot be released until students have made that restitution for damages. And it is absolutely removing things like, so there was a time when school districts could withhold the transition of records when a student moved to a new district or made a transfer. That was another opportunity for school districts to kind of recoup any lost fines or fees, was they wouldn't release the transfer records until until families paid that. But now that is no longer allowed either. So they must release those records so that a student can enroll in their next learning opportunity. And so that's part of that law, so that language was struck. And then it speaks to, again, a policy that should probably mimic the policy from the student fines and fees about what a family's options are for it to satisfy that debt. And that's kind of why I put them in the order that I did and said, once we solve the problem kind of once, that language starts to repeat itself moving forward throughout the subsequent policy.
Anybody have any questions or feedback?
No, I like it as read.
Okay, but if we change the prior policy, we might be changing this one though too, right? Just some of those language?
What I would suggest is, since you made the decision in the first one to not take an action at the April meeting in terms of voting to approve these as they stand, which it's a good idea, that I'd make the attempt to mimic that language and that look in this policy as well. So if there's language that's addressing, what needs to happen for a student based on intentional damage or destruction versus loss, that they align that way. So it's very clear again what the staff responsibilities are, what the parent and student options are moving forward.
But we aren't withholding transcripts from colleges and things like that based on, we're not currently doing that, right?
No,
Based
that's
on,
never been our intention, but now it is illegal for us to do that.
okay. But we haven't been doing that heretofore. Okay,
No.
good.
I have a question. There's in my policy work and some of my union committees, we're told never put websites because websites can be dead. And so I noticed that there's a website in here, and I don't know if that's a practice that we have. So maybe instead of putting a website, which can become a dead link, that we put like a content or a topic that they can search on the Secretary of State's website instead of a direct link. That's just feedback, and I don't know how good or accurate that is. That's just what I've always been told.
This is true, again, whenever we present the first reading of this, it's always in WASDA's pure form. So if it's the board's, and it does make, again, you're right, anything in that language could change. So it should say maybe investigate the topic at the general website.
Correct, yeah.
Or
that
search.
makes- Yes.
So this will most likely be something we discuss at our next policy meeting, not see on an agenda.
Yes, to ensure that there's alignment with the three, just because you don't want to adopt one and then you get to a point where you're saying kind of three different things about a similar topic.
Right.
Any further discussion or feedback? Sounds like we're ready to move on, Dr. Harmon.
Wow, we are on the roll. I will not turn it down. Okay. And so last but not least is our grading and progress report policy. Again, last revised in 2021 for WASDA, last revised in KSD 2001. There's a slight change to the title. The concept and the content is the same. Again, the rationale is the same as well. The House bill changed, and so the language in our current policy, as was at the time, school districts could withhold transcripts, diplomas, for student fines, fees, debts, and that is no longer allowed. And so the language actually removes that, and so now I will show you our updated policy per WASDA.
Yeah, because the other two policies talk about now just withholding the diploma. But that's, when you're talking about diploma, just so we're clear, I think we're clear, but you mean just the piece of paper that they could hang on their wall?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so what's really fascinating about all of this is that most families and individuals take more pride in the diploma itself, but the diploma does not get you, that diploma does not necessarily get you a job interview or into
Right.
the transcript that is access to your next phase of life.
Okay, yeah, because I just,
It is the trophy.
It is a
yeah.
It is the trophy
yeah,
you get for
Yes.
doing the hard work of 12 years.
Yeah.
Nobody's
13.
asked me ever for any diploma I've gotten in any of my education ever. They always want the transcript, is what they
Yes.
want.
But I
Those are
just,
the ones that we frame and take pictures of and
Yeah.
family members and all of that.
I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing anything.
I have a little more serious question. In the last paragraph, it starts talking about what teachers must do in order to assure that everything has been communicated in advance. And my question is, all right, so I'm teaching American government, and first day of class, I hand out the syllabus, the grading policy, the weighting of the grades, and evaluation techniques and behavioral standards. Is that adequate under this language?
Yes. And as well as things like to parents, so I think even at elementary school. So when they talk about things that the student will accomplish during this grading period or over the next 6 weeks, those satisfy what this is. What they're saying is that a student should have an ample opportunity to know what's expected of them so that they have an opportunity to meet that expectation.
Oh, okay, but this just brings up an interesting point, and thank you for pointing it out, because it was in my notes, but I almost forgot it. So, this graded participation activity, I know in my life with my kids, that's choir concerts. So, a graded participation activity can be a choir concert, it can be an assembly, you know, like in grade school, there's, if you don't take orchestra or band, there's, the choir usually does a performance of some type, which is usually during the school day, but a lot of times in secondary schools, a graded participation activity is a choir concert or something, and sometimes based on just access to buildings or performing arts centers in these schools, you don't know at the beginning of, you know, you might not know that there was a graded participation activity on a specific date at the very beginning of a term.
While they may not know the exact date or time because of availabilities, typically when it comes to the performing arts, students are made aware that there are at least one culminating kind of performance that is expected or required for participation. And that's what they're intending to say. And they're saying that if the teacher does not give that notice in advance, then they cannot make it. So that you can't tell me it's April 6th. You can't tell me that on April 16th, that there's a required performance that I must attend and it will be graded and expect that I show up. It has to be in writing, and then that is the piece. And then the policy also offers an appeal opportunity to the principal. And there's always the opportunity of, I think it's interesting, that policy goes exactly to the formal process. I would think as a parent, I would hope that I would talk to the teacher if our circumstances were different before I'd go straight to the principal. About possibly why and see what else we could use or solve for my student if we were unable to participate.
Because yes, again, sometimes it's a transportation issue, and, you know, parent might have to work the night of the choir concert and there's no one to give a ride, you know, so.
My question was similar to Director Clark's about, like, does this contradict anything that's in the collective bargaining agreement for KEA or other staff?
I cannot say that I've taken a very close read to compare what is required in terms of student learning goals, but I believe that our certificated teachers are required to have learning goals for our students. Because they have goal-setting conversations. I'm sorry, I muted myself, have goal-setting conversations as part of the calendar year with students and with families. And those are actually communicated in writing.
Okay, I just don't want to vote on a policy that will contradict ACBA of one of our bargaining units.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question for us to make sure that we make sure crosswalk there. I did want to point out, it does say goals or standards. We have standards that are in place. The goals, I see how we're getting to those standards. And so, and then the heart of this is, okay, we don't want to use dates that we don't even know about or that have passed
Right.
and hold students accountable. And if there were some other extenuating circumstances, then, let's talk, that's that appeal piece.
Right.
Hey, we fully intended to attend that. However, on that day or evening, weekend, I had a family emergency, whatever that might be.
Right,
So,
yeah.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
No.
All right, moving along. I think we're ready for the next one, Dr. Harmon.
Great, so needless to say, we're also not moving that one forward. The intention would be that we will make those changes and then bring that back as well. So that concludes our kind of student grading transcript diploma discussion as far as policies go. And now we will return back to the board's focus on the 1000 series and proceed from there. The next is policy 1240, and it deals with committees. Previously, again, it's not been updated very recently per Wasa, 2011, but it is more recent than our version, which was 2005. It is discretionary, so there's not a legal requirement to have this. I apologize, I don't think you can see the PowerPoint, can you?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, we can.
Oh, okay.
It's there.
It just said, okay, for a second, it didn't look like I was sharing it. Okay. It does address the board's intention around participation in committees. I think this has come up at the dais a couple of times as different committee opportunities have presented themselves. And the board always questions, not just this current board, but other boards have questioned who can participate, when can they participate. There are board members that were active participants of committees prior to them joining the board or being elected to the board. And wanting to continue some of that. So this is an opportunity for the board to clarify, again, what that looks like, how they'd like that to happen, what would be the role of a board director as they participate in these committees, how many board directors participate, what their obligation is to come back and inform the other board directors. All of those pieces could be worked out here. Then there's never any question about, it reduces the number of questions about what is possible or allowed.
Questions, comments?
I know I brought this up because in my whole time on the board, there have been citizen committees, and I have pointed to this policy. I'll first say my intent to go into a committee meeting, we represent the community, so if they're at a meeting, it's not a meeting, I don't want to go to talk. I want to go to listen. So, and that language isn't in here, and it's not clear that, if you go attend, say, the committee that I first asked to go attend some meetings was the back to school task force meetings. And so, that's when this first came up. And again, it was just an intent to go listen because citizens were talking about it. And then in the end, I ended up and I know that President Hamada asked to go as well to that. And then recently it came up because I talked about the boundary committees, and I think Vice President Beno maybe expressed interest too. And again, so I do agree there's not language in here to just go, look, board attendance isn't a participatory necessarily, because that's not my intent, it's a listening. Because sometimes citizens will tell you something and, it's like it happened at this committee meeting. And so that actually happened with the back to school task force meetings, I ended up, because so many parents were writing, I ended up talking to about 15 to 20 parents that had been on the back to school task force after it had been implemented. And they were really upset about things that had happened and that didn't come to fruition. And so, but I wasn't there. I didn't, I had asked to go. And so then it gave a sense of, I've never had a citizen say, in my time on the board, I've never had a citizen say, wow, I don't want any board directors at that, committee meeting to observe. But I definitely have heard staff say they don't think the board should be there. So when we're talking about transparent governance and leadership, I agree that we should have some parameters, but I also think that if citizens sit on any committee in this district, that if board directors, without violating OPMA, so only 2 at a time or whatever, should be able to participate with the guideline, some guidelines, right?
As an aside, like, besides serving on this board, we are members of this community as well.
Right.
And so, like, while I understand there needs to be rules so we don't break any laws about 2 board members or whatever, I agree with Director Bettinger. Like, I don't necessarily want to be on the committee to make decisions. Like, I don't need to make decisions. I do that up here on the dais. I don't need to do that for the committees that are intended for citizens. But I would like to be extended an offer being like, maybe I'm the liaison for the boundary review and you're the liaison for financial committee or whatnot, because I think it's important that board members participate either by being there, just watching and listening, or even participating by having a community member chair or co-chair that committee so that there is participation. And the community should see it as board members working with them, alongside them on committees. So I don't know how we can capture that in this, but like, I don't necessarily want a voting role or whatnot. I don't need that, but I do want to be extended opportunities to be invited to participate in some of these committees that exist.
I just wanted to say I appreciate that. That's, as a administrator here for quite some time, we've had board members on committees, and I remember, I see Mr. Heath, when I first came back from Seattle, we had our MTSS-B task force that met for several years. And I believe we had a designated board of directors that was there. And then I've also myself had, a family engagement policy task force where our task was to take a look at it, to look and see how we were going to apply a model that we were looking at. And had a board member, as Vice President Beno mentioned, that kind of assigned. So I don't think that that's the intent, or if that is, that's something I think this policy allows us to do. I think it's more about the board saying, so how can we utilize ourselves in a way that, from a time perspective, who might be able to join a different committee, I guess.
Right, and I don't even think it's so much as, so like, I like the old language, and it's interesting, the one advantage of these old policies is to see it's kind of how WASDA changes things over time, and it's like, to me, WASDA's newer language kind of excludes board from committees, which I can understand if a board director is going in and like, okay, I'm going to run this committee. And so that's not the intent. So I would more propose, because the language at the very bottom, an at-large capacity, their role as either an observer or active voting participant will be determined by the board. I think you could update this by just removing the language, honestly, or just changing the last sentence. The role is as an observer, and then to Vice President Beno's point, you could just change the last sentences to make it 2 sentences. So their role is as an observer, and only as an active participant if determined by a vote of the board, or something like that. So just taking that last sentence of the old policy and making the roles more clear that the intent is that they're an observer.
And I just want to add one more thing to that. Even though a lot of times we go participate in community and committees. There's only one board member that knows what happened. Therefore, it would be nice to have meeting minutes sent to the rest of the board so that we are all aware of
Yeah,
what
good idea.
transpired in that meeting. Therefore, when we're coming back to make a policy or vote on something, we know instead of one board member.
Yeah, excellent idea. And then, you know, so that last sentence could even say, be an observe and report member, 'cause-
Report back, yes.
right? Because even then, like, if a board director is at a meeting, maybe that's the intent too, at your next, you know, board director report, it's like, oh, you know, I happened to have the opportunity, chance to go to a boundary committee meeting, and, you know, they were all having excellent, robust conversation around moving 6 to middle, and, so I'm excited to see that it's moving forward, or what, you know, something to that effect, that,
Yeah.
Yeah, you did, Director Bender, you actually explained, I recalled it was Karen DeBruller who,
yeah,
and she would in her report, that
Yeah.
here's, you know,
That's- yeah.
happening in the
Yeah.
MTSSB
Yeah.
committee,
Absolutely, absolutely.
and great stuff happening,
Yes.
and we would support that, and, yeah, it's happened before, and so I think we're on the
Yes.
right track.
I just want to
I
make
think
sure.
Yeah.
the other piece I'd like the board to consider
Mm-hmm.
is sometimes there is a task force different than a committee. So a task may be that they are coming up, and there's a short period of time that
Right.
a decision needs to be made, or as a committee might be long-standing for maybe a different time frame, depending on what it is.
right,
And that I like the idea of the language because depending on the topic and what they're doing, we want these committees or these community or staff, whoever is on this, to be able to speak freely and say,
Right.
here's what we believe.
right,
And that's why I like the language, that it really delineates, okay, we're as observers.
Yeah.
We just wanted to keep the rest of our board abreast of what's happening.
Yeah.
Around our work, and so.
Yeah.
I
and
see-
then it would, and, because especially if you require a vote of the board for a board member to get in, to be an active participant at a task force meeting or something, then that's a bigger discussion, right?
Yeah, because I also remember, and I think Director Clark helped me with this, I think you were here when we established a task force where their task was to bring back recommendations so that the board would be able to consider them.
Right,
So that really depends on the task.
yeah,
And so.
And you don't wanna-
So keep that also in as you consider language to this
yeah,
policy.
yeah, because that's really, I think it would be a rare case that you would be a voting member or anything. It's just, the intent is
Right.
to just observe and report.
Right.
And, you know,
Other feedback or questions?
I just want to be, it's not exactly clear in the old language how the board director gets placed in a meeting. So one of the reasons why they moved the language is this was in the 1000 series, but a
Right.
lot of the original language addresses a community member's responsibility.
Yeah.
So committee members may be appointed by board members or the superintendent
Right.
to represent certain areas. It doesn't necessarily speak to how a board director gets to participate. And I think that's the gap that's addressed
Oh,
in the
so-
new language. So it's like a trade-off a little bit.
so obviously there is, right, there's meeting invite to the committee.
Yes.
So could, you know, I don't know if it's something where it's like, oh, I have interest in that, so invite me, and then I can, you know, because I don't want to give any more work to anyone, but if it's just you add board members that are interested to the invitation, and then they reach out to. I know, but then so like, say, 2 board directors, because only 2 have expressed interest in boundary committee meetings, but say more did, right?
We can have more than 2.
Right,
because otherwise-
but what I'm saying is I'm not gonna be able to go to every meeting and things like that, but I think if you were asking me how to do that on a quick fly, I'd say just invite the board to the meetings, but then they have to respond back to Naomi saying, I want to go to this meeting, And then, she can easily say, Vice President Beno's going to that meeting and Director Farah is going to that meeting, so don't go. They're already going.
Can't we just do that at a board meeting, though?
Right.
And just say, hey, here are the community
Yes.
committee opportunities, who's interested in this
peasy,
one,
yeah.
who's interested in this one?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do it like that? Like, I don't know how we would write that in a policy, but,
So typically when we, so first, all board actions of the board as a collective have to take place at an open public meeting.
Right.
Yes.
So if there were gonna be a discussion of assignment to that or roles and responsibilities in committee, it would need to
Right.
happen at a board meeting. But I think that there's some benefit to having that kind of conversation in advance in the public, because it also, facilitates then how the report back happens as well. So then, there's an expectation of the update during like board comments at the end when the board addresses kind of what's happened. So it's possible that typically when we are engaging our community, especially on very large topics that have, far-reaching impact, there's a presentation to the board, informational to the board about the start of a committee, boundary, strategic plan, back to school task force, all of those pieces. And so I think that would be the opportunity. We could, at the time, bring an agenda item for the board to discuss what board members would be assigned or volunteered to that particular committee. And as you said, like having one board member and an alternate, then it also provides consistency of kind of who's participating.
yep.
And based on interest and all of those things.
Right.
And because you all are working on and developing this policy in the midst of existing committee meetings, what I'm hearing is that once you all have determined the process for you all to determine who attends which meetings, we need to bring you the slate or list of committees.
Yes.
So that the board can have that discussion and then
Right.
assign their active members.
Correct.
Yep.
But how do we make sure that what you just said reflects on this policy?
We could write procedure could be written.
Okay.
Are there procedures for this policy, or do we need to create a procedure for this?
There aren't.
Would we need to create one, or would we just put it in policy?
I think it might be best in policy to have the protocol of how a board member gets assigned or picks to serve.
Right.
Because then that way it's clear, if there's any changes to that,
Yeah.
it actually happens with a board discussion versus procedure can happen without a board discussion.
Yes, agreed.
And
And,
especially since these 1000 series policies specifically impact the board and their actions.
right. And so you're correcting the open one, which is the WASDA model policy, so I'm,
Yes, I want to make
yes.
sure I was, yes, I am. So I'm in that one. And I made a note to the side. You may not be able to see the comments. It's not
Yeah.
scribbled.
Yeah.
But you prefer the language of the original policy.
Yeah,
But now I'm writing that you would like to have a section that speaks to how a board director is, how they volunteer and how the process
Right.
of selection for committee service appears. And what I've heard us talk about so far is you all bringing that to a regular meeting agenda and having a conversation about the board directors the two board directors that would serve.
yeah,
And then that being, that also gives you an opportunity in that meeting to take a real vote if you want to change the role in terms of being a
Right.
voting or participant
Right.
rather than a observer.
Right.
So all of that could happen at that time.
And I think I already saw you change the language of that last sentence about, it was more specific to be an observer. Yeah,
But that's what you said, but it's just, I
Yeah.
said or voting, yeah, I was trying to like add by a vote of the board. So I've been trying to update as you all
Yeah.
talked
To that
about
meeting,
this, kind of
yes.
what the pieces
Yeah.
are.
Thank you.
So what I
Yeah.
am hearing is that we're going to have a second draft iteration of this.
Yes.
Yes.
And there'll be a second reading and another review. But I think that we're on a good path to having a policy that will allow the board to have clear parameters and access to committee.
right.
Yes.
The idea is not to disrupt or silence, the idea is to, mostly to observe.
Yes.
I actually like that language a lot. I mean, not that it's my policy, but
Right. Yeah, the goal is not to disrupt. The goal is to observe and report. That's maybe even simpler, right?
Other feedback, comments, questions? I feel like we're on a roll, Dr. Harmon.
I know.
What are we doing, Tim?
Remember we said that.
He keeps us on track too.
I just want to make sure I don't lose any of this. And you can always type well and fast when no one is
Yeah.
looking. So-
Yeah, of course.
That's fine.
True.
No pressure.
Just don't want to lose any of it. Alrighty. Okay. So now we are going to our next policy. And speaking to absence of a board member. So I was just kind of churning through our 1000 series. This is an encouraged policy, last revised in 2016. However, Wasa made some brief updates in May of 2020. And so since the board has been engaged in just kind of going through and updating all of those policies, brought this forward for the board as well.
So we actually updated this in this, I was
2016.
sitting on this board when we updated this in 2020. We did update this one.
Okay.
We
This
updated,
is interesting, like I don't see track changes on this, I'm not really clear.
so, yeah, because this one, when it was up there, because I remember this one, because like what I just said about the last one, I said absence of a board member, we added the language that it wasn't meant to be punitive. Yeah, so
Right.
we did actually update this in May 13th, 2020. And we added the language that said an excuse, that said, this action is not intended to be punitive, but expresses the desire of the board to operate with a quorum. So we added that language.
Okay.
So I swear we updated
No,
it.
it says right there,
Yeah,
2020.
yeah.
Yeah,
I swear.
it says right there.
You have a lot of policies to keep track of.
It says right there.
I-
So what we will do, unless the board has suggested changes to this, we will put the language will shift. Instead of saying last updated, it'll say last reviewed, and it will have the date of tonight.
Yep.
I do have a question. The problem, of course, is when board members get really upset and think that they're not satisfied with their service on the thing and stop showing up. And in small towns, that does happen. But the way that this reads, an excused absence of a board member will be voted on in the consent agenda prior to the absence. Now, the reality is we have emergencies.
Yeah, we've never done that. So, good point.
Yeah.
So my question is whether additional language should be added on how we would handle it if it's a last-minute emergency and doesn't make the consent agenda.
So this came up, this actually became a very interesting sticking point. So thank you for bringing that up. So often it isn't, that's when we had this long discussion before in May of 2020 it's how do you approve it? And some districts have it on the consent agenda just as a standing item approving absences. And yeah, and so retroactively. Yeah, so if has not been enough notice to include the absence on the date of the consent agenda.
Yeah.
And then the consent, it's actually, so the decision was that because it's noted in I remember this now, it's all coming back. The decision was, because, for instance, I think it's Renton School District that I looked at, that they have a standing item on the consent agenda to approve absences. And it's like, sometimes it would say, no absence too, but then the discussion became, well, it's on the meeting minutes if someone was absent. So when you approve the meeting minutes, the absence of someone?
No. no, there's a trap here.
Yeah,
There's a big difference between being absent
Right.
and an excused absence.
right.
And the distinguishing here is the board is acknowledging this was an emergency and we already know
Yeah,
they couldn't
yeah,
be here.
right.
But I do appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'd agree. I think the consent agenda should have a line for excused absences.
Yeah, that was the intent, and then it became, honestly, a personal issue between some board directors. So that was the intent, is that there'd be a standing item on the agenda, on the consent agenda, or, you know how the consent agenda is, it's like, I got an order, like meeting minutes and this, and then if there's any gifts and any supplemental personnel reports, et cetera. I think the intent is more to have it just as a standing item if there were any absences to excuse.
Well,
Right, like what you just said.
okay.
But that was the intent. It didn't happen because some personal things happened, so. Which you can watch the meetings if you want. I now, it's all flooding back to me. I think I had blocked it out.
Do we, well, all right. So I guess what I'm asking Vice President Bento is, the resolution to my problem would be to make excused absences listing on the meeting agendas.
I mean, I don't know if we have the authority here to do that, but we can make that.
Well, if
Request.
we get, yeah, but.
Policy already says that's what we're supposed to be doing.
So we just need to
Do it.
do it. So it's like, I don't know who we need to then direct or help support in doing that, because I don't know what that
I
looks
see
like.
Naomi writing notes. Yeah.
Superintendent, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Harmon.
No, interim superintendent, no, please, I didn't know if you were.
No,
I didn't hear you, sorry.
I was going to say, just for clarity and for the record of the work session, I think that we have to be clear in what we're asking, because we are working right now on a policy and language, okay?
Yeah.
And what I just heard was a process for
Right,
excusing, and so I just want to respectfully say that that's where we are, to bring us back.
yes,
And so, if it's something that's in the policy,
it
in
is.
terms of language, it is there.
Yes.
And
It's there.
so, that's,
We don't need to change the policy, we just need to follow it.
Follow it,
so
yes.
now, for process,
For process,
we would say that typically what we have Ms. Antello and others who followed through with those pieces. And so for agenda setting, that would be the superintendent and the board president to make sure that that is followed.
Great.
Make sense?
yeah.
Yeah, but just out of curiosity, don't we mention that every meeting before it starts, that who's absent? We say that.
It's, again, that's not the same thing.
Yeah,
Excused absence and absence are not the same thing. One
Right.
carries a legal penalty.
yeah. So, and that's why we added the language that it's not intended to be punitive. So if someone was ill and missed 4 meetings, you wouldn't want to go, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
Yep.
you're off the board because we don't like you, and because you were, sick for a month, you're off the board, so that's why we added that language. It's all flooding back to me now. Oh my
But then my
gosh.
question also would be like, who makes that determination if I was really sick?
Right.
Right.
Someone else was like, no, you were mad, so you didn't come 4 times.
Right.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
Right.
that,
No, actually, that's
sticky
resolved because
Yeah.
you're voting on it.
Mm-hmm.
Once you put it on the consent agenda, you either approve it or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets resolved with an actual vote.
great.
So are you saying that if oh my gosh,
Wait a minute.
so someone's not, someone, this is Michelle's 5th meeting that she's missed, and, I'm not gonna excuse these absences anymore.
Well, if you quit going to Las Vegas, it wouldn't be a problem.
But
Right.
with all seriousness, I just want to know what the process is, and as Vice President Beno said,
Yeah,
who decides? How do we determine whether that is?
In every elected body I've been, it's communicated through the board chair or president. because
Yeah.
that's where the call is made.
Yeah,
Okay.
So you know, if you want to raise a question on it, you
Mm-hmm.
have to do it before the vote.
and as,
The biggest problem is when people don't call and don't show.
Yeah, no
And-
call, no
And there are reasons why that could happen.
right.
Oh,
And you bring back another thing I was just gonna say that came up in 2020. It was mostly that this is about that no call, no show situation. And so I think it's, you know, on the consent, I think when I researched this 2 years ago, which my brain is remembering, is all absences are considered excused by the board unless you pulled it off the consent agenda to discuss and say, look, I don't think it's excused. And-
oh,
Yep.
okay.
You know what I mean? I
Okay,
think
okay.
that the intent
I see
is,
what it's
you're
to
approving
assume.
to excuse the absence, and you would only not because Tim might say, Michelle went to Vegas 5 board meetings in a row.
Right.
So I don't want to excuse any more of those absences. Right? Is that what you're intending to say?
Well, that,
I believe the intent of the policy too is to allow the board members, board directors, to be accountable to themselves and the work that they've
Yes.
committed to
Right.
on behalf
Yes.
of
Of
the
the
community
community, yes.
and the district. And so that
Yeah.
you essentially obligated yourself to a certain number of meetings
Mm-hmm.
at minimum, and, you know, are you holding to that? And then what powers or abilities do the other board directors have to subtly remind you
Mm-hmm. Right.
that you made that commitment?
Yeah, that's true, absolutely. And again, I'm a fan of accountability.
Yeah.
Great. Other feedback? Oh,
I did make a note about the standing agenda item, but I don't hear, I just want to confirm, I do not hear any changes to the language of the policy. I wanna
No.
make sure I didn't miss it. Okay.
I don't hear that.
But I think exactly what you said, Dr. Harmon, about just last reviewed is going to be good, because then it will give us a chance to have a similar discussion, you know, in front of the public. Well, I mean, not that the public's not watching now, hi. But that it'll give the opportunity to have, you know, to just remind that that's why this is showing up now on the consent agenda, because we're going to follow this policy the way it was intended to be followed.
Correct.
Thanks to Director Clark for pointing that out.
Other feedback? It sounds like we are ready to move on.
All right, so we're moving on from absence of a board member to ethical conduct for school directors. Again, we're kind of moving into this discretionary space of policies for, in the 1000 series in terms of board actions and responsibilities. This was last revised in October of 2021 per Wasa. And it has never been on the books in KSD. It is not, it's discretionary, so it's not required of the board. But since the board is kind of making an effort to really go through it and complete the 1000 series, I wanted to bring it to the attention of the board and give you the option. And so this is an example of a policy that will have no markups because, well, it's all marked up because it's completely new to Kent School District.
Feedback, questions, comments?
We have a policy 1002 that WASDA doesn't have, that we last revised in April 13th, 2005, which is a code of ethics, which is similar. So I'm wondering if 1002 needs to be retired to adopt this, because otherwise, I mean, I'm fine to have a code of ethics and an ethical conduct for school directors, but they seem to be similar but not duplicative.
So 102.
I had the same kind of comment when I noticed that we had that policy as well.
But I do like the WASDA language.
so would you rather swap out then?
I would personally, if you're asking me, I'd rather swap out I'd rather go with 1825 and retire 1002.
I would actually prefer substitute.
Okay, substitute?
I'm curious because of the numbering of WASDA, if the process would actually be, like at our last meeting, we voted on the process of retiring outdated policies. So I'm wondering if we would adopt this one and retire the other one based on our last board meeting that we
Yeah.
discussed this.
Okay, that's fine with me.
Yeah? Yeah?
That was gonna be my suggestion and preference, just so that it would continue to align with WASDA's numbering.
Right.
Otherwise, the district, and the board may be put into a situation where WASDA has another numbering for the policy 1002, and then we'd have the situation of, well, what do we do? We'd have to renumber at that point, because there'd be two different policies with the same number.
Right.
So, if we can keep it aligned with the numbering with WASDA, that would be my recommendation and preference.
Right, and this one also aligns with the next policy we're gonna probably talk about.
Yes,
So,
it is.
so, yeah, so the retiring of the old and bringing in this. Yeah, that's,
1,002, yeah.
yeah, retire 1002. Or 1002.
Have we done I mean, I agree with that statement, but have we done a side-by-side to make sure that there's nothing 1002 that we would like to incorporate into 1815?
Give me just a second, I can pull it up for you on the web.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's,
I mean, I obviously have it in front of me too, but I was just wondering if,
yeah.
Somebody has done the comparison, yeah.
It's, the 1002 is more like the protocol guideline than it is, but again, it's a good idea to look at them side by side, I think.
I have to say, I'm really, we are in 1825 now?
Yeah, but we're looking at 1002. Do you want to look at it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here you are, I apologize for that.
That's okay.
Just took me a second to make sure. There you are. See if I can make that a little bigger.
Do you want to look at it bigger?
No, thank you, yeah.
See?
this is where having two screens would be beneficial.
Absolutely.
I know.
I can make an attempt to try to share both, but it's gonna be small.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no.
No,
It's just
Okay.
taking a minute
Yeah.
to look. It's okay. Did you have any you want to
No,
copy? Okay. Did that help?
I mean, that's why this is a work session, right? So
Right.
we can work.
We're doing work.
Is everyone comfortable? Do they want to see the WASDA version?
I'm comfortable with 1815.
I apologize. The last piece here, so we may come back to this policy, although you're in agreement with where you are. Depending on the language that you choose for 1825,
Right,
there may be language you want to add. So I just want to go on record saying that right now, it seems like you all are okay with where you are with this policy.
Yes.
However, after looking at 1825, you may want to make a change. So
okay.
I'll take us there, and then you'll have an opportunity to,
Oops. You're going to 1825?
So we're clear that we're gonna substitute 1815 for 2002, or 1825.
18, swapping 1815 for 1000.
1002.
Yeah, that's,
that seemed to be the intention that I heard of the board.
Right. I
But-
just wanted to clarify. Yeah.
And the question, just for clarity, that Vice President Beno mentioned, is there anything in what we are, quote, retiring that we may want to make sure that we
From
want to
there.
include, right? And that's what,
yeah. And that might just take another meeting, and,
Yes.
you know, it might take more time.
Yeah.
If, I'm fine, I've looked at them both, because
Okay,
I
I-
noticed
I
it,
just
so I'm
have to-
fine.
I-
Yeah.
If I can,
Oh, sure, I'll get it, hold on.
the old one.
Oh my gosh, I lost the tab, hold on.
Close the tab, Control Shift T.
Oh yeah, I do that all the time too. Everybody does that, Tim. Okay, here we go. I'll make it big.
Well, there are several points in that particular policy that I think should actually be listed in the, before you get into the process of how you're gonna deal with it. Because the way I read 1825, I mean, it basically says, you know, the board president has determined there's a problem here, and therefore, they want to deal with it in such and such a fashion.
Right,
But you're very specific in the earlier version of the things that you're saying, these are going to trigger a reaction.
right.
So is it possible to steal that list and insert it?
I apologize, I was trying to find unmute. So what I'm hearing is you'd like to kind of merge the two policies. So take the list from 1002 that's a little more explicit and stated.
Right.
And merge that into this?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that's possible. That's doable.
And if we were gonna merge that list, then I would want to spend more time with 1002 to make sure
Right.
that I was
Yes.
comfortable with the list.
Correct.
Which I don't disagree with merging the list.
Right. But I
And,
want to be more-
yeah, no, I appreciate the question that was brought forth by Vice President Beno, because I think that's a purpose for this work session is, and I appreciate it because are we really, you know, because
Yeah.
1825 really is broad.
Yeah.
And it's
Yep.
us together, the board, you know, and 1002 is, some of them are real specific to Director Clark's point, so the board may want to consider
Right.
what you're talking about, and that is
Right.
emerging.
Well, some of this is, I feel like, in our board protocols too now.
Right.
And so it's just kind of teasing out what needs to go
Yes.
and what needs to be added.
yeah. And also it goes back to what we did with 1001, which was, we kept the more specific list than the more general WASDA language, so that would be consistent with what we've done before
Yeah.
too.
Correct.
Point.
So.
Okay, so what I believe I'm hearing is that the board is not going to address 1825 until they have another review of 1815.
Yes.
And in that review of 1815, what the board is expecting to see is a merging of 1002 with 1815. And possibly another crosswalk of the protocol as well. Did I miss anything, or did I?
I think just for our, I don't know, I think just for us, it's just looking at what, some of the things are similar to what's on the protocol guidelines. So do we want to keep them here, or do we want to keep them on the protocol guidelines, or both places? Sometimes it might be valid to keep them both places too, so.
Right.
Yeah, the 1002 references in the last bullet
The protocol guidelines.
follow the board protocol.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments, feedback? Dr. Harmon, do you have anything else for us this evening?
So congratulations. I knew that we had a slightly shortened version of this. I do have 2 other updates. If you recall, there was just a bit of an issue at the regular board meeting in March with policy 1001, where the language did not exactly reflect the desired changes of the board. And so that policy was included in your folder just as proof that we intend to put that back out there for your vote and review, because you were advised not to approve the version that did not have the language that you wanted. Although you don't approve procedure, there was procedure provided informationally, and it also did not have language that was necessary and reflected the policy. So you will see both of those in the April board meeting, just to close the circle with the March meeting. And so congratulations, we have covered the entire slate that was on the docket tonight. Thank you. And we did it right on time.
18.
Our next scheduled policy meeting, actually we have a few minutes to take a break, grab some water, some coffee or something. Our next regular scheduled policy meeting will happen on June 6th, 2022.
Okay,
Not May?
not May?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's April.
Oh, I was like, wait a minute, what happened to May? I thought you had something else.
Is it Wednesday? What day is it?
Yeah, I know.
So yes, I apologize. Yes.
Dr. Harmon, I would say that our board is on top of it today with, I saw that myself as well, and so
Yeah.
I'm glad someone is.
that extra time really allows us to
Yes.
really take a look at the
Yeah.
language, right?
So May, it'll be
May
sometime in
something.
May. Yeah.
Yes, the board is committed to, and we.
May 4 is
This
what
year.
Naomi's waving at us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Monthly policy review meetings, and we've kept to that.
Great.
cadence. So yes, there will be a May meeting.
Great.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Interim Superintendent Vela, do you have anything further?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. It's a great conversation today, and appreciate it. Look forward to our continuing work on policy.
Awesome. At that, it is 6:57, and we're going to adjourn this meeting.